The bronze-tipped spear pierced through Hector's chest as Achilles claimed his victory beneath the walls of Troy. But for Andromache, watching from the battlements above, her husband's death was only the beginning of a nightmare that would make his brutal end seem merciful. What awaited the wives and daughters of fallen warriors in ancient Greece was a fate so systematically cruel that death on the battlefield became a blessing their husbands could no longer provide them. The clash of bronze against bronze had fallen silent across the blood-soaked plains. The victorious Greek warriors stood among the corpses, their armor gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, but their work was far from finished. What happened next followed protocols as ancient as warfare itself, practices so embedded in Greek culture that they were recorded not as atrocities, but as natural consequences of military triumph. Before we descend into the documented realities of how ancient Greeks treated the families of their defeated enemies, consider subscribing if you find these forgotten chapters of history as compelling as I do. Your support helps me continue exploring the darker truths that shaped our ancestors' world. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from as we uncover these historical accounts together. The moment a Greek phalanx broke through enemy lines, a carefully orchestrated sequence began that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with systematic subjugation. This wasn't the random violence of battle-drunk warriors. This was policy, refined over centuries of warfare and documented in the writings of historians who witnessed these events firsthand. When Sparta conquered Messenia in the 8th century BCE, the systematic treatment of defeated populations became the template for Greek warfare that would persist for nearly 1,000 years. The Spartan approach was methodical. Adult males who had borne arms were executed immediately, but not out of military expedience. The killing served a deeper purpose, removing protectors and providers while leaving the most vulnerable members of society completely defenseless. But the wives and daughters of these slain warriors faced something far more calculated than death. Greek military law, codified in practices that appear throughout historical accounts from Thucydides to Xenophon, established clear procedures for what they termed the allocation of human spoils. Women were immediately sorted into categories based on age, physical condition, and social status, a process that took place in full view of burning homes and the corpses of their male relatives. The sorting happened with bureaucratic precision. Young women of childbearing age comprised the most valuable category, often marked for transport to slave markets in Athens, Corinth, or other major trading centers. Older women faced immediate execution alongside the men, deemed too costly to maintain. Children presented special opportunities, with boys under 10 frequently taken for training as helots or slaves, while girls entered what Greek records describe as preparation programs designed to ready them for specific roles within the conquering city-state. The psychological warfare embedded in these procedures was as calculated as any military strategy. Families were forced to witness the categorization process, mothers watching their children assigned to different fates while knowing they would never see them again. Greek commanders understood that this psychological trauma would spread throughout remaining populations, making future resistance less likely. Contemporary accounts from the siege of Melos in 416 BCE provide chilling documentation of these practices in action. When the Athenians finally broke through Melian defenses after months of siege, Thucydides recorded what followed with clinical precision. All adult males were put to death. The women and children were sold into slavery. But the historian's matter-of-fact tone masks the systematic nature of what occurred. The Melian women weren't simply marched to market like livestock. They underwent what Greek military manuals called processing, a series of procedures designed to break psychological resistance while maximizing their value as human commodities. The process began with deliberate separation from their children, not for practical reasons, but to create maximum emotional distress. Greek commanders had learned that traumatized women were more compliant and less likely to attempt escape or rebellion. The scale of these operations reveals the industrial nature of Greek human trafficking. When Alexander conquered Thebes in 335 BCE, approximately 30,000 people were processed through these systems within days of the city's fall. The logistics alone required sophisticated planning, specialized personnel, and established networks of buyers throughout the Mediterranean world. Greek slave markets operated with the efficiency of any commercial enterprise. The Agora in Athens featured dedicated sections for human trafficking, with established pricing structures that fluctuated based on supply and demand. A young Thracian woman might command 15 to 20 silver drachmae, while skilled craftswomen or those with musical training could bring significantly higher prices. The Greeks didn't invent slavery, but they systematized it in ways that previous civilizations had never achieved. The journey to these markets created its own horrors. Women destined for sale were transported in specially constructed ships with cargo holds designed for human transport. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks reveals ventilation systems, water storage, and waste management specifically engineered to keep human cargo alive during voyages that could last weeks. These floating prisons were designed for systematic dehumanization. Women were stripped of clothing, names, and any personal possessions that might remind them of their previous lives. They received numbers and basic garments that marked their status as property. The process was calculated to break psychological resistance before they reached their final destinations. Greek records indicate mortality rates during transport averaged around 12%, considered acceptable losses by merchants who viewed human cargo through purely economic calculations. Women who died during voyage were simply thrown overboard, their deaths recorded in ledgers alongside spoiled grain or damaged pottery. But survival of the journey only led to new forms of systematic exploitation. The Greek concept of war brides became central to their expansion strategy, a legal framework that transformed rape into marriage and murder into justice. When a warrior died fighting Greek forces, his widow automatically became property of whoever claimed her, not through informal tradition, but through codified legal doctrine with specific procedures for establishing ownership. This claiming process required witnesses and had to occur within specified timeframes after the husband's death. Greek military courts maintained detailed records of these ownership disputes, treating them as standard property cases. But legal ownership was merely the beginning of a transformation designed to erase every trace of the woman's previous identity. Names were changed immediately, often to Greek versions that bore no resemblance to their birth identities. Religious conversion was mandatory, enforced through procedures that combined psychological torture with ritualistic humiliation. The conversion process involved public ceremonies where women were forced to renounce their previous gods, often required to destroy sacred objects from their former lives, while Greek citizens watched and jeered. Those who refused faced escalating punishments designed to break resistance without reducing their commercial value. The Greeks maintained conversion centers in major cities, facilities designed specifically for processing conquered women. Archaeological excavations at sites in Aegina and Salamis have revealed building foundations with specialized chambers, drainage systems, and restraint mechanisms that paint a disturbing picture of systematic psychological warfare. These centers operated for decades, processing thousands of women through standardized programs designed to erase cultural memory and replace it with complete subservience. The programs typically lasted 4 to 6 months, long enough to ensure pregnancy from systematic assault, creating biological bonds that made escape psychologically impossible, even if physically achievable. Children born from these forced unions faced predetermined fates based on gender and perceived usefulness. Boys showing promise were often inducted into Greek military systems after being separated from their mothers at age 7, following the Spartan model of child rearing. Girls were evaluated for their potential as future breeding stock or domestic servants, sorted with the same clinical precision applied to their mothers. The separation process was deliberately traumatic for mothers, serving both practical and psychological purposes. Women who lost children to Greek systems became more dependent on their captors for emotional support, a calculated strategy that reduced escape attempts and rebellion. These systematic separations created generations of people who never knew their true origins or family connections. Greek legal codes preserved in inscriptions across the Mediterranean spell out procedures that legalized every form of exploitation imaginable. These weren't aberrations or violations of law. They were the law itself, codified in stone tablets that survive today as evidence of systematic brutality disguised as legal doctrine. The concept of temporary wives became central to Greek military culture, allowing soldiers to claim women for specific campaign seasons before transferring them to permanent owners. This rotation system maximized the psychological trauma inflicted on captives, while ensuring that no woman could form lasting bonds that might lead to protection or advocacy. Greek military records from campaigns in Asia Minor describe these rotations with bureaucratic precision, treating women like equipment to be shared among units. The documentation reveals mortality rates, replacement schedules, and efficiency metrics that reduced human suffering to administrative statistics. The economics driving this system created feedback loops that intensified over time. Military commanders who captured valuable women received bonuses and preferential treatment in future campaigns. Slave traders who supplied high-quality females gained exclusive contracts with major Greek cities. The entire military and commercial structure developed around the systematic exploitation of conquered populations. This wasn't limited to major battles or sieges. Greek forces conducted regular raids into neighboring territories, specifically to acquire women and children for various uses. These raids followed seasonal patterns, timed to maximize captures while minimizing military risk. Entire communities lived in constant terror of harvest time raids that could destroy families overnight. The raids were planned with military precision, using intelligence networks that identified the most valuable targets. Greek scouts would spend months mapping villages, identifying the most attractive women and healthiest children, planning routes that maximized human capture while avoiding military confrontation. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of abduction shaped entire cultures. Parents would deliberately scar their daughters' faces or conceal them in underground chambers during raid seasons. Some communities developed elaborate warning systems and forest refuges where women and children could hide. But the Greeks adapted their tactics, using torture to force villagers to reveal hiding places, turning survival strategies into death traps. Greek historians wrote about these practices without shame or moral questioning. Herodotus describes the systematic enslavement of Persian women after Greek victories as natural consequences of warfare. Plutarch recounts similar procedures following Roman conquests of Greek cities, noting the irony of Greeks experiencing what they had inflicted on others for centuries. The cultural normalization of these practices reveals how quickly civilized societies can systematize the unthinkable when power goes unchecked. Greek art from the classical period depicts scenes of women being led away in chains as decorative elements on pottery and frescoes, treating human trafficking as aesthetic subjects suitable for public display. The documentation exists because the Greeks saw nothing shameful in their procedures. They recorded their methods with the same attention to detail they brought to philosophy and mathematics, preserving evidence of systematic brutality that operated across centuries. The archives remain, scattered across museums and archaeological sites, waiting for historians willing to confront these uncomfortable truths about the civilization we often idealize as the birthplace of democracy and enlightenment. These stone tablets and buried archives reveal a civilization that transformed human suffering into administrative procedure, reducing mothers and daughters to inventory items in ledgers that survive today as monuments to systematic cruelty. The Greeks didn't just conquer territories. They engineered the destruction of human souls with the same precision they applied to mathematics and philosophy. For every statue of Athena that stands in a museum, remember the countless women whose screams once echoed through Greek conversion centers, whose names were erased as methodically as their cultures were destroyed. The next time you hear praise for ancient Greek civilization, remember that their concept of justice included the systematic brutalization of the innocent, and their legacy lives not just in marble columns, but in the unmarked graves of those who suffered fates truly worse than death.